Hello world, welcome to the Science, Technology and Future podcast. We have Keith Wiley with us again, he's been a long-time transhumanist and the author of Taxonomy and Metaphysics of Mind Uploading. So today we'll be discussing the philosophy of mind, and we both agree that that's a pretty trivial subject. So all aboard the good ship Theseus on an adventure through this fascinating sea of identity theory. We've both been traumatized by video conferencing software, and I'm not sure if I'm the same person I was half an hour ago, but here we are. I'm sure I look like the same person, but oh God, I certainly don't feel like it. While my intuitions do shudder and entice me to swallow this jagged blue pill of philosophically informed ideals of identity, it is quite a choppy journey. So yes, might I be the same Adam at the end of this interview? Who knows? Might you, listeners, be the same listeners at the end of listening to this interview? Hopefully you're not as traumatized as I am. No, if you're not familiar with the idea of the Ship of Theseus, we'll be getting to that, and we'll be discussing all things good Ship of Theseus. We'll be sort of on an odyssey with Keith Wiley on the subject of mind uploading. So yes, as I've mentioned in previous interviews, Keith Wiley has a Ph.D. in computer science and is one of the original members of the Mind Uploading Research Group. So welcome, Keith Wiley.
Hello, thank you.
So firstly, let's talk about like what the Ship of Theseus story is, and what the meaning behind the Ship of Theseus might be.
Right.
What's it trying to convey?
So Plutarch, which is one of the great Greek historians, sometime around the first century, wrote biographies of many of the other famous Greeks, including the king Theseus. And in this writing, Life of Theseus, he describes how Theseus came home from his voyages across the sea, his various kingly adventures. And then Plutarch poses this sort of interesting question. He says, well, they preserved his ship for many years, and they replaced the planks over and over again. And then Plutarch poses it as an open question. So, should they then have interpreted this old ship as being the ship that Theseus had actually taken out on his voyages, or was it some other ship? And in modern times, people have rediscovered this writing, and sometimes they take it as having some sort of implied conclusion. They're saying, oh, the Ship of Theseus is a parable in which we do conclude that a ship's identity survives, piecemeal full replacement, or maybe you conclude that it doesn't. But Plutarch's writing, if you read the original passage, he didn't offer an answer. He just posed this as an interesting question. And it has been picked up as one of the sort of the canonical examples of in identity discussions. What does identity mean?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And look, I forgot to mention before, but yes, you've just created an awesome animation on the Ship of Theseus, which does leave open the answer, and people just can watch that. And I'll put a link to that in the description. So
I believe it was the impetus for this interview, in fact.
In fact, it was, yes, I got excited. But hey, look, it's a pretty important subject as we move forward in time, not only for mind uploading purposes, but now, I mean, we're living in what some have deemed as a participatory panopticon, in a sense that we're being recorded from many angles, not only by Big Brother, but little brothers and sisters. And it's kind of like our current selves will be sort of rendered in, almost real-time pitch perfect image quality and audio quality in the future, and our future selves might look back on our past selves. Maybe in the future values will be different, and we'll be thinking, oh, why was I acting like that? And other people will also be able to see our past selves. So yeah, the idea of identity, whether it's a fungible concept over time, or whether it's even a fungible concept from moment to moment. What was it, Heraclitus, who spoke about this? The river is never the same thing over time.
You can't step in the same river twice.
Yes, you can't step in the same river twice.
Of course, that's only one conclusion. But yes, so Heraclitus was basically asking, if the identity of a river is basically its momentary material or physical state, or maybe even its individual constituents, the individual atoms, then a moment later all those atoms have swept away, and the new atoms aren't even in the same basic configuration. The shape of the waves changes. So, the question Heraclitus was asking is it actually a different river in instantaneous slices of time, sort of across thousands of years? Or alternatively, can we say no? That's sort of a silly, sort of a ultimate reduction of identity to say that identity basically, cannot exist in entities changing across time. Instead, should we have some notion of identity that is more meaningful to us? To say that objects persist over time even as they change, and of course. The big question in the room, where this all leads, is the nature of personal identity. How does a person, presumably in their psychological traits, but many people are very concerned about the physical traits of a person's body. Should we say that a person's identity, whether dependent on physical or psychological traits, is truly some sort of cohesive, persistent thing across life or not? The thought experiment posed in the 1700s, I believe, by Thomas Reed of the Brave Soldier, asks, you have a child who shares some overlapping memories with this middle-aged person who, in the parable, is a soldier, and then the soldier has some overlapping memory of this old-aged person, but the old-aged person, in this example, has no remaining memories of his childhood. So this says, that the person in the middle, the 40-year-old person, has sort of an identity connection to the child and the old person, and yet the old person and the child have no connection to one another. This is, sort of all part of the same question, all sort of part of the same philosophical exploration.
Definitely. Yes, so I was speaking to Anders Sandberg quite a while ago. I've just been editing some of the videos now that I did with him in an interview, and it seems as though he believes that we will be moving into a time where our intuitions about identity may not serve us as well as what they have in the past, and we may be moving into an era where we need to sort of update our sort of understandings of what an identity might mean. But identity is a bit of a thorny concept there. So, I mean, yes, we've spoken about mind uploading before, but just to give people a refresher, how does this relate to mind uploading? How does identity relate to mind uploading? And I did actually cut you off if you had anything you wanted to say.
Right. Well, the identity question in mind uploading is very important, especially to most, when people start worrying about what the implications are of mind uploading. They get very concerned over what's going to happen to their identity. I don't think it's an unfounded concern. If you perform different kinds of, you can consider it in various different ways. Let's first of all say we confine our considerations to destructive procedures in which the biological, person and brain don't survive. Even within that subset of scenarios, people still have diverging opinions, such as some people will say identity would be preserved if you perform a Ship of Theseus on the brain, literally performing a piecemeal replacement of the physical components, commonly the neurons. If you replace the neurons on an individual basis, perhaps with other neurons, but then we wouldn't be talking about uploading into computers, or alternatively with these sort of microscopic neural prosthetics, which are the sort of the common trope in these thought experiments. If you perform gradual replacement uploading, then do you preserve your identity? Most people are most generous to that scenario, but we can then ask about a different destructive scenario, the most common sort of other version being the static or frozen scan and copy, in which a brain is rendered into a static state. One of the common examples being cryonic preservation, but there are other ways. Once this brain is basically totally frozen, and I use the term not with reference to temperature, but just with reference to dynamic change over time. There are room temperature versions of freezing the brain. Once it's frozen, you could slice it into two-dimensional sections, scan the structure, gather up the connectome, which is the physical topological structure of the network of neurons, and sort of reinstantiate that pattern in some sort of emulation, a whole brain emulation, and run that emulation. The emulation itself, the system on which you're emulating it, might be some big massive computer simulation and software, but it also might essentially be the exact same physical device that would have resulted from the gradual replacement procedure. Maybe you take this scan of the data slice by slice, you scan it all, and you use to build a physical artificial brain out of microscopic computers, which is exactly the same product that would have resulted from the in-place gradual replacement. But then we ask the same question, well, in that case where we sliced and scanned the brain, did we somehow not preserve identity, even though sometimes people will conclude that we did preserve identity if we did the piecemeal Ship of Theseus replacement. So this exact question, whether the gradual replacement procedure as opposed to the scan and copy procedure should be interpreted differently with regard to the specific question of preservation of identity or personal survival. Does the person who's subjected to the uploading procedure survive into the uploaded system? This question was the topic of the paper that Randall, Kona, and I published in March 2016 in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, and we worked really hard on that paper, and I would love for people to take a look at that.
Mm-hmm. But I'll put that in the description.
And all of that is just one small subset of these scenarios, which are the destructive scenarios. And then the thing that people often get the most hung up on is, well, wait, if we can imagine any non-destructive variation, then does that have tremendous implications for this question of preservation of identity? If the biological and original person and their brain is unharmed by the procedure, perhaps even totally unaware the procedure has occurred, then does that mean that the identity that results in this upload, this computer, this robot, although I don't like the term because people imagine C-3PO-like systems instead of very nanoscopically sort of warm and supple systems, but if we did a non-destructive procedure, does that say something new and profound about the relative identities of these individuals? Does it make some statement about their identity that would not have applied in the destructive case? So the reason that people will often favor the gradual replacement is that they can't envision any way in which that could result in survival of the original. And the reason they will reject scan and copy, the slice and scan and copy, is that they can very easily imagine that perhaps you scanned it without slicing it into pieces. Perhaps you did sort of a static kind of like structural MRI scan of this frozen brain and then instantiated that in the whole brain emulation, but then you also sort of revive the original scanned brain. So it's easier to imagine a non-destructive scenario, and because it's easier to imagine, people then are jump more easily to the conclusion of rejecting that identity is preserved in that scenario. The whole point of the paper that Randall and I wrote was to sort of show that the line of reasoning favoring the gradual replacement of the scan and copy is actually on our analysis doesn't really work out too well. It's very easy. Well, it's not very easy. It can be adapted to show that the gradual replacement scenario can be adapted through your sort of thought experiment manipulations to be a non-destructive scenario. So we can imagine a gradual replacement scenario in which the original brain actually does survive. You can imagine that as you make these microscopic replacements, instead of killing the biological neurons, you just sort of create two neural nets that are sort of interwoven through each other. One is the original biological one, and one is sort of this, duplicated artificial brain, which is the exact same product that would have resulted from the gradual replacement system. You just didn't kill the biological system as you went along, and then. Now we've sort of converted the piecemeal Ship of Theseus version into a non-destructive scenario. Does that say something totally new about how we should conclude the preservation or lack of preservation of identity? So I'll stop there and let us sort of go on to the next thing. But this is where this sort of personal identity issue comes into mind uploading, it's a huge question, because people are deeply concerned over whether their identity is going to make it into an upload, or whether they sort of loosely, I say loose because I don't think it's a very well-founded claim, but they say that the upload is some other person or a doppelganger, some kind of a mere copy, and by mere I mean not truly worthy of the identity that we're so concerned with. And we can move on, but it's like a lot.
Well, what are some common objections to this? What are the best, if you were to steel man or most strongly represent the arguments against this, how would you convey them, and what are your responses? Like, one that comes to mind, which I sort of hear, but not necessarily, I might be misunderstanding the argument, is a continuum of an emergent property of a brain state, of a series of brain states.
Right.
So it's not actually the neurons; it's some emergence, if you know what I mean, which can't be sort of represented in just the sum of the parts.
Right. So this is often described as sort of a requirement of some sort of functional or procedural continuity, that you require that across time the brain actually be sort of frothing along. And if at any point the brain, sort of came to a sort of metabolic stasis, even if it came to a stasis and then was turned back on, aside from any uploading concern, just if you brought a brain down to some static freeze and then started it again, that perhaps we should judge the person to be some totally different person in this case. I have many responses to this, but the first is that I just don't think that we would actually draw that conclusion in that scenario. If we brought a brain down to a totally static state and then revived it, and the person seemed to come back just as easily as coming back from anesthesia or waking up or recovering from a coma, these cases in our real world experience in which we judge a person's identity to be preserved, if we were able to do this other scenario where the brain is brought down to a state where we sort of objectively state that the brain came to a stop, does that mean that people would sort of treat this person completely differently? And I just absolutely reject it just seems totally unbelievable that people would start rejecting a person's claim to their identity and treat them as if they're some copy. I just find the plausibility of that claim preposterous. Aside from that, it's an open question. Should we say, and I do say should we say, is it a choice we make? I'm not sure if there's some sort of underlying truth to the identity question here. I'm not saying that, I'm not sure we can say that identity is or is not preserved if the brain, goes to a static stop and then restarts. I don't know if that's a truth claim about the nature of reality as so much as a choice we get to make about how we choose to judge the reality in which we live. But, let's say we chose that position, that, if the brain kind of stops and then starts again, we're going to call that a new identity and a death of whoever was there before. I think that that's a strange place to go, because, I guess for the reason I said, just that I don't think people would actually treat each other that way. They wouldn't actually regard each other that way. But also because we have all these real-world cases that are getting very close to that scenario. We have basic losses of consciousness, but then we have some very extreme medical cases. One that I'm interested in is these rare medical cases that are called rapid frigid drowning, where someone, essentially drowns in a lake that is, an icy winter lake, and they are submerged for sometimes an hour, and they are then brought to an emergency room and revived and are healthy. There are very few cases where this has happened. And no one should make the mistake of thinking that the brain froze into a block of ice, and then the person. That's not what happens in these medical cases. The person's body temperature sometimes plummets I can't remember what the examples are. The term 50 degrees Fahrenheit comes to mind. Maybe I read that one of these. So clearly nowhere near freezing. So then the counter argument that many people will say is, well, the brain didn't completely totally freeze solid. There was, some, sort of underlying metabolic and even neurological, sort of action potential activity. The brain didn't really stop. Therefore, we will allow that, identity is preserved even in these current extreme medical scenarios. But, like I said, that's a strange, slippery rope of reasoning, because what happens when we sort of push our medical science to the point where all of a sudden one day we can do this? We go from 50 degrees to 45 degrees to 40 degrees. We're able to bring people back from these medical disasters with ever-improving medical technology, meaning they can survive these lower and lower temperatures. And all of a sudden we get to the point where we're able to actually bring someone back, who was essentially frozen. And let's call it a thought experiment. Let's not even ask whether it's technically feasible. Let's say, what would happen if all of a sudden we lived in a world where this medical case occurred and everyone was reading about it on the news? Someone froze solid and was not miraculously, but through the wonders of science, was actually brought back. Within the whole world, start treating this person as some sort of peculiar doppelganger wearing the body of someone who had died. In this scenario that we were considering, they act exactly like the person had lost consciousness in any medical accident and come back. So, are we really going to go down that slippery rope? Or are we just going to admit that it's a slippery rope, say that thought experiment makes no sense, and say that, bringing a brain to a halt and then bringing it back again is a silly way to pass judgment on personal identity? We're pretty far off the original topic, which was the Ship of Theseus, but
the Ship of Theseus is an introduction to this. Yeah.
In the video we're talking about here, the Ship of Theseus video that inspired you to contact me for an interview, we haven't really told the viewers what that video is. It presents the Ship of Theseus, which many videos already do. But one thing that I specifically and intentionally do in that video is slowly expand on a set of hypothetical scenarios that push the boundary of our intuitive expectations. So I show that you basically fall into these paradoxes where you're forced to conclude that identity of a ship is going into one ship or another ship, and you end up sort of forced to choose, and from there you get this paradox. And I show it in many different ways. Thomas Hobbes in the 1600s, raised one of the classic extrapolations, which is, so you do a Ship of Theseus replacement, and you end up with a pile of rubble, which is all the original material, and then you build a ship out of the rubble. So now you have two ships, one which was piecemeal replaced and one which was built from a pile of rubble, but that was all the original material, right? So this is what Hobbes presented in the 1600s. And people have had plenty of time to sort of think about that and form their conclusions. But in the video, I show many other extrapolations. What if you have two ships and you perform this sort of reflexive Ship of Theseus between the two of them until each one of them has undergone a piecemeal replacement with all the parts of the other one? This is just another scenario I show in the video. And I won't list them all here because I actually show several in the video. I just can't list them all here. But that's the point, is to present these interesting scenarios and then allow the viewer to kind of introspect about, what do we think is the nature of identity if the physical system can undergo these various kind of bizarre transformations. And I pose it as an open question. In most cases in the video, I don't actually put my finger down and say, here's the conclusion. In a few places, I say, this is how we seem to treat things generally in society. But in many cases, I just, in the video, I just sort of show a weird scenario, and then I just say, so what do you think? I think this is an open philosophical question, and I think it's interesting.
Yeah, sure. Now, so I guess from a personal perspective, it's different from like a social perspective on someone who's survived a brain trauma or somebody who's survived being like knocked out or unconscious for a while. Like, it sounds like a harrowing experience being drowned and submerged in water for an hour and then being revived again. I wouldn't
There is
want
no
that to happen
experience.
to me.
But there is no experience. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah, right.
once you lose consciousness, sort of all medical trauma is the same until you wake up from the coma in the hospital. What's the difference?
Yeah.
Um,
Well, moving into the future, I mean, people are forced to face these sorts of choices. It used to be just transhumanists thinking about this, but there's been quite a bit of news coverage about cryonics and how one might be revived, and mind uploading is a big feature there. And
yeah, no, I think
destructive brain scanning is a huge like a feature of of cryonics and the possible revival mechanism for cryonics. Yeah, but even
I'd say the whole world is sort of slowly coming around to these ideas in a more modern era. I agree with you that it's more commonly sort of presented. The problem is that many of the Hollywood depictions, they don't really, people are then exposed to just sort of the general idea of either cryonics or mind uploading or something. But Hollywood does not really, in my opinion, it often doesn't give a very fair sort of telling of the open-ended ways in which we might choose to interpret things. Any one director or producer kind of wants to draw a conclusion and leads the audience to that conclusion, which I find frustrating because I often disagree with them.
Fair enough. Maybe this sounds like a bit of a Hollywood depiction, but like if you were forced, okay, so in the future when we do have this kind of technology, what's your intuition about how people will make the choice of whether to jump in like a transporter, which destroys the original atoms and then reconstitutes a copy of the patterns in order to just jump down the road. Say you wanted to go to the park and there was a traffic jam. How likely is it, do you think, people would just jump into a like a replicator and get their information sent to the park instead of having to
Well,
drive there?
let me put it to you this way. How likely is it that people would jump into a big metal box that's capable of traveling 80 miles an hour and then send themselves barreling down a highway? If you asked someone that hundreds of years ago, they'd say nobody would ever do something so reckless and insane. So the answer to your question is we are all comfortable with the society in which we find ourselves and the technological capabilities that our society presents to us. So if you ask someone from our era if they would sort of step into a transporter if immediately presented to them here and now, or if you were thrown into the future through a time machine and saw a transporter and said, okay, now you've lived in the future for 5 minutes and had no time to acclimate to your change. Now please step into the transporter. That's how people interpret these questions, and then they get very sort of concerned. Oh, how can I'm sure people would not subject themselves to such a sort of a bizarre procedure. But in the future, it won't be a bizarre procedure. It will be, assuming such an invention comes into existence, it will be just everyday life. It'll be as boring as a television to them. So whether or not people in the future will be willing to use something like a transporter, a teleporter to move around, will basically be a question of whether they spent their whole lives growing up surrounded by other people using that and observing, sort of the social implications of a world in which people do that. And if it's just commonplace, then you'll take it. That's kind of how Star Trek presents it, right?
Yes.
The reason people like McCoy and Barkley are so weird about transporters because they're sort of afraid of them. The reason that they're such idiosyncratic characters is that they stand out from the crowd. Everybody else just thinks transporters are just a good way to get around, and McCoy and Barkley are just they're actually not representative of a real future society. They are stand-ins for us as observers watching them in the 20th century, and basically used to sort of let us think about how weird the transporter is for us. But they don't actually represent what people in their world would be like. Now, there might be a few weird people. There are probably people today who are just, they just won't get in a car that goes 80 miles an hour because they just, they can't come to grips with the notion. So there could always be someone who just can't get on board with the concept of a teleporter. But the question of whether society would generally accept it, well, that's just the nature of societal norms, right?
Yes, I guess so. Well, this whole question of identity is, often confusing because we only really, well, the common term for identity is, well, yeah, identity, but we may need more nuanced terms in order to scaffold more complex and more interesting scenarios. So, well, is the term identity good enough, really, even for today's use? Does it fully work?
Um, I don't know. People seem to be starting to think about this and starting to worry about it, which means maybe the way we think about it right now isn't good enough. Um, I don't think that we're in a desperate hurry to solve this problem. We're not going to have, mind uploading in the next 10 or 20 years. So it's not something that we've got to get grinded out right now in all of our debate forums. But a place where it might be more of a pressing issue before anything like mind uploading is possible is extremely visceral virtual reality, where people sort of project, their personas into characters. Then in these simulated worlds, where all sorts of strange, physical events can be simulated in the world. So, for example, in a simulated virtual reality world, you can very easily take someone's avatar and just sort of make duplicates of that avatar, and then you have to make some sort of decision about where the person on the outside is going to get to control these avatars and whether that has sort of implications for how identity is represented from within the simulation. But in terms of how we really perceive minds and consciousness and what brains are, it's hard to imagine how it's going to be an issue for quite a while, actually.
So, I mean, it's probably going to be played out in Hollywood depictions like a lot more in the near term than it is in scientific discussions, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think fiction's definitely where we try this out. A lot of fiction writers have already, written great books in the last 20, 30 years. Arthur C. Clarke wrote about mind uploading in the 50s, City of the Stars. So, but Chris Egan and Greg Egan, and any number of others. Altered Carbon is going to be turned into a miniseries later this year, I believe. Who's that? Stephen Baxter. Accelerando, which is by Charles Sartre. So, yeah, I mean, fiction is often where we find these, and it's definitely true that the novel writers tend to give it a much more careful consideration than the Hollywood movies. I think you can find much more interesting explorations of mind uploading and sort of how it plays into personal identity. You can find much more interesting versions of this in books, frankly.
Yeah,
go read a book.
Absolutely, and definitely recommend Greg Egan there for sure.
Yeah.
And yeah, so what is your favorite science fiction writer who's covered the mind or the mind uploading concept? What's your favorite book, or top whatever?
Yeah, well, we just listed most of the ones that have really sort of taken the topic seriously. Permutation City by Greg Egan touches on a few interesting things. One of the really interesting scenes, one of the great scenes in Permutation City is where they are stopping and starting a simulation, and then sort of over and over again, and describing the internal simulated person's experience of having no realization that their reality is stopping and starting on the fly, and yet they still have this completely conscious experience of their sort of perceptually continuous existence. So that's a good, that's sort of an interesting anecdote that I remember recently reading. I don't know.
That's really interesting. And this is that the people doing the simulating are actually also in the simulation. at that stage. Is this where they got they create like a world based on, an arbitrary set of chemical properties or physical
Oh
properties?
yeah, no, that was definitely Permutation City.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, I mean, another popular trope that shows up over and over again is stacks upon stacks of simulations. One of the biggest reveals in Hollywood is the reveal that you're in the simulation, not just doing a simulation. 13th Floor, The Matrix has been over. This has been done over and over again. It's getting kind of cliche at this point, but maybe it's a cliche now because everybody's really thinking about this, and no one's ever really given it a lot of serious consideration except for a few eccentric writers, and now everybody's thinking about it.
Especially after Elon Musk said we could be living in a simulation. And then, I have a video of an interview with Nick Bostrom, and that shot up in like views. So.
Yeah, well, all right. So if we're going to segue into the whole "are we living in a simulation" thing, then I have to get something off my chest, which is, I'm personally, I find the whole "are we living in a simulation" question sort of totally uninteresting, and I think it's categorically a bad question, because reality, I guess it's sort of an interesting question how you define your sort of reality and whether it's defined by your perceptions. This is Plato's cave, but if the best way to sort of conceive of the reality in which we live, if the best way to conceive of that is essentially sort of the experiences that we have, our conscious experiences, our sensorial experiences, and how we gather them together, how we interact, then there's no such thing as either living in a simulation or you don't. You simply live in some coherent set of rules, and you call those rules physics, and that is the nature of reality. Whether it's some simulation in a completely external concept of reality is kind of a non-question. I don't really understand the question, honestly. And yet everyone else seems to understand it and take it very seriously. I think it doesn't mean anything to say you live in a simulation as opposed to saying you don't. There's no difference, and therefore it's not a real question. I'm sure anyone watching this is probably thinking of all sorts of reasons for why they disagree with that, because everyone seems to take this very seriously. I guess that's just how I feel about it.
I guess people want to know whether they can escape the simulation to some bigger reality. If we are in a simulation, I hope it's a simulation that we can sort of get out of. If we are in a closed universe and there is something outside of this universe, I hope it's a universe that we can kind of escape one day instead of huddling around white dwarves.
That has been the obsession of religion forever. Right? Can we escape this reality and go somewhere else?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm not sure what to make of that. If there is some escape hatch, presumably it is accessed from the outside. So we sort of wait to be plucked out by the gods. It's not like we fly around the universe looking under planets and turning over stars to see if we can figure out where the... It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, we live in this reality, and if there's some external reality, we'll just wait for that to come along. What's the point of debating it?
What confused me about Permutation City, and this is a bit of a spoiler, but what confused me was actually how the simulated sort of alien life forms within the simulation, how they actually got out, and how they took control of the simulation one step above.
Yeah, I actually don't remember the book in enough detail to speculate on that, but it's a very good question, right? Even if you could get out of the physical realm in which you live, what would it actually mean for you to be in the next realm? I mean, what does it mean for your mind to be in the next realm? I don't know. To be honest, I'm not really sure how to speculate on this. I find it unspeculable.
Well, here we are.
Or at least
we're on the voyage of the Ship of Theseus, talking about simulations. But yeah, so what would a voyage be without a thought experiment that involved trolleys? As with the classic trolley problem, we have a trolley hurtling towards down a track, hurtling towards 5 people, and well, if we change this thought experiment slightly and then say, well, suddenly, there's also the option. Actually, let's step back a bit. There's also an option to divert the train in order to go along another track in order to save the original 5 people. But let's just say there were another 5 people that suddenly appeared on the other track. So yeah, there's a fork in the track. You can pull a switch to divert the train away from the original 5 people towards 5 carbon copies, so to speak. Um, would you should you leave the train to kill the original 5, or and save the replicas, or kill the replicas to save the original, or wouldn't it matter?
Right. So the original trolley question, I think there's one person on the other track, and the question is, first of all, whether you should commit one person to death to save 5 others, and second is whether there's a distinction between taking no action and taking a definitive action, which kills another person.
Yes.
In this case, the question is very similar, but instead of a 1 to 5 balance, it's 5 bodies in each case. But should we have some sort of denigrated or derogatory judgment of the either identity status or just the mere value of life of one of those 2 branches? So should we take an intentional act, throwing a switch, to make sure we kill these 5 people over here instead of those 5 people over there? And then, thrown in to try to bias our discrimination against one set of them, we say, oh, well, some of them are just uploaded copies, so maybe we don't care about them. So this comes back to the major theme of my book and the major theme of much of my writing on this topic, which is that in the case of non-destructive mind uploading, which is what this scenario entails, I'm a very strong advocate for, let's see, what's the exact way I phrase this over and over again? I say that a mind upload, has the exact same primacy in their claim to the original identity as the non-destroyed sort of biological original. How can I say something like that? Most people just find such a notion preposterous. It seems so obvious, sort of on first pale, that if someone is left intact by an uploading procedure, that whoever the upload is must be some other person, and that the original is still the same one in the original body. It just that's how people intuitively or initially judge these scenarios. And I really just don't judge them that way. And I'm not just talking about the moral implications. I don't judge them that way in terms of where the identities actually reside in the scenario. Because I don't believe that identity is a physical trait, because I believe it is exclusively a psychological trait, basically the state of your memories and your sort of who you perceive yourself to be in every.
Uh-oh.
That identity can conceptually split or branch. That's the only way to describe this in a way that's consistent with what I'm trying to convey. And the best way that I can describe this is by referring to sort of mental ancestors and descendants. So this gets into the question of whether it's the same person, because I'm now referring to descendants and ancestors of a given identity. But it's the way I can sort of express the idea. And I'll say that if you have 2 minds, 2 people, who are both sort of mental descendants of a single common mental ancestor, that it doesn't make any difference what the various relationships of their bodies are. By both being psychological descendants of an ancestral mind, they both get equal primacy in their claim to that identity. And now you're stuck in some weird paradox, because if they're identified as the original, if they're both identified as the original persons, does that mean they're identified with each other? And yet they clearly can't be, because they're next to each other and they're independent, consciously thinking beings. And all that means is that identity does not have this transitive relation in the first place.
Right.
So just because they both equate to the ancestral person, it's just a false assertion to even question whether they're identified with each other. It just doesn't work that way. Now, many people will just throw this out the window. They say that I'm being ridiculous. But it's very easy to come up with scenarios that make it extremely difficult to favor the physical or biological sort of criterion of identity. And the very straightforward example was given by Derek Parfit in his book in 1984, Reasons and Persons, which is, well, if we're going to place all of our primacy of identity on the body, then what are we going to do if we just cut the body in half, cut the brain in half? So let's take an uploading scenario in which you cut the brain in half and upload each half into some sort of half replica and glom together two brains, each which has half the original and half of an upload. Now you've got two brains. You throw away the old body and you put them both into new robots or bodies or whatever, so that you don't have to worry about whether the arms are the ones carrying the identity or something ridiculous like that. So now in this scenario, if someone is going to favor, physical, material structure in determining identity, now what do? Now you're stuck. What are you going to conclude about identity? What if you divide it so that 51% of the original biological matter is stored by one of the survivors? Does that 1% make some difference? I mean, what if it's the difference of one atom to the left or right? What difference does it make? What if you cut the brain up into 3 pieces and make 3 brains where each one gets 2/3 of an artificial, an upload of the missing 2/3, and then each one has 1/3 of the original. I mean, you can sort of play games with this all you want. The point is, we can't just easily conclude that identity must go with the physical stuff. First of all, as I just showed, it can be paradoxical anyway. It doesn't just easily resolve itself. But secondly, I don't understand how people think their identity is in the physical stuff. I mean, it's rather disingenuous to amputees, for one thing. What are we supposed to say? I mean, where does the line between what material matters and what material doesn't matter? Where would we draw that line? The brain? Why? The neurons, the glia. Is it not the whole brain? Is it just sort of the mitochondria? You have to save the mitochondria, but all the rest of the stuff can be replaced. I mean, the arguments over whether physical preservation has any role at all whatsoever in identity just fall totally flat for me. Mm-hmm. It's all psychological. Our identity is our psychological and memory and personality traits. It's the only conclusion that makes any sense to me.
Okay. Well, part of what you were talking about there seems to relate to the identity of indiscernibles that Leibniz brought up. I thought it might be worth discussing that briefly, but also I'd like you to talk about the worm theory of identity.
Yeah. So I admit to not being an expert on this. I'm basically conveying other people's ideas, but the worm theory basically imagines this 4-dimensional worm where the 4th dimension is time. So imagine, a physical structure, say approximately a sphere, because I'm using my fist to approximate a sphere. So you can say that through time, you can sort of draw this temporal worm, which is sort of the tube, that this sphere tracks through space. And I think that's where the notion of a space-time worm comes from. It describes how a physical object translates through space across time, and then its trail through space trail back through history is the worm, essentially. Now, the worm theory of identity is essentially that identity was never a single static, momentary, physical, 3-dimensional structure in the first place. We were wrong to think it ever was. The worm theory says that identity is that 4-dimensional structure. And if you look at some time slice, you're not looking at a whole identity, you're looking at some little piece of it. So that's the essence, I think, of the worm. Like I said, this is not a field in which I think I'm an expert, so I hope I conveyed it correctly.
I think that was quite clear, actually. Another. Sorry. Yep.
No. That was a summary of the worm theory, and then that has various implications for how to resolve these scenarios. So the Ship of Theseus, for example. Let's go back to Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes' extrapolation, where you do a Ship of Theseus, piecemeal replacement, end up with a pile of rubble of the original material, and then make a new ship. Well, sort of visualize that whole scenario now as this sort of movie through time where you're tracking, the volumetric space that each of the little planks follows. And of course, they sort of come apart, but then they come back together again, and they're kind of sort of cohesively rebuilt into one ship over here and one ship over there. And the point then is, if identity was the 4D worm, then what you basically get, at least by my interpretation, and I'm happy about this because it seems to be sort of, it works with my own theory of identity, is that if the 4D worms are identity, then you just get branching identity for free. This branching identity that I described just kind of falls out of the system. So let me take a simplification of the piecemeal Ship of Theseus. This is an extension of what I described earlier about splitting a brain in two. So this is another scenario in the video, the Ship of Theseus video I made. So you take a ship, but instead of doing this whole piecemeal replacement, you just take a ship and you cut it in half. And you split the halves, and then you build two new ships out of the missing halves. Okay, so that's I show that in the video, and then I ask, okay, so what did we do with the identity of the ship here? So now just imagine what the worm theory says. So you started with one ship, and then as you go forward through time, this ship kind of diverges physically in space, to the left and the right, and is then joined in by these two built missing halves. Now the point is that the two worms are distinct. They go through slightly different places in space. The fact that they're distinct means we no longer have to ask the question whether two identical things are somehow different or the same thing, because they're not two identical things anymore. In the worm theory now, these two things go in directions. So the whole notion of identical things being sort of compared for whether they are the same or not, the whole thing just goes away because there is no identicalness to consider. And more to the point, like I said, you can get the branching interpretation very easily from this. So if we do this to a person, if a person diverges in two different directions, you can imagine very easily these sort of two worms which converge in different locations, and you just sort of split the identity in half. Now, the best way to do this to disregard the dependency on physical systems is to ask whether worm theory can be easily applied to pure psychological states. And if it does, then once again, we kind of get this natural branching of identity. You have one person defined by one cohesive psychological state housed in one physical brain. And then by some mind uploading scenario, you get to the point in time where you have two physical systems which are giving sort of inspiration to two mental states which are no longer identical because their worms have already diverged. So they're already distinct people. We don't have to worry about whether they're the same as each other because their psychological states have evolved in their conscious experience. And they're just natural branchings of the original. And we don't have to ask ourselves whatsoever whether the original material played any role in determining who gets to own the original identity. And the question just doesn't stand anymore. That's worm theory.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think it's interesting, these branching of identities can be a bit of a tricky concept to understand, but it certainly makes sense to, to me intuitively. I think one of the things that might tease out some of the possible hidden details about these is like the idea of accidental and essential properties in identity, and the idea, like, for instance, like, let's just say Batman or Superman, they both have alter egos. One of them's, well, Superman has Clark Kent and Batman has Bruce Wayne. Now, from a social perspective, it seems as though they're completely different people. Like, Bruce Wayne isn't Batman, but Batman isn't Bruce Wayne, unless you really know. Okay, you're a good friend of Batman. You have that private information. But from Batman's perspective or Bruce Wayne's perspective, they're the same. They're the same person. So, but I think in the comics, at some stage, somebody takes on the role of Batman who isn't Bruce Wayne. Okay, so the persona of Batman is adopted by different people. So from a social perspective, or from a legal perspective, who don't know the actual character that's behind the mask, this Batman persona is responsible for all this stuff that's happening in Gotham City that may be done by more than one person. Okay, so it could be Bruce Wayne's colleagues who, put on the mask and costume and go out and save lives. So yeah, how does the concept of accidental and essential properties play out here, do you think? What would you consider as important accidental properties identity? What are the essential parts of identity?
Don't read a lot of comics.
Yeah.
I don't know. I follow the analogy. Um, I I guess I don't have a profound response to that, except that um, I'm not entirely comfortable with determining identity by some external observer. Whether or not someone is identified as X or Y based on whether other people recognize them and sort of grant them, this, that, or the other identity, is exactly my argument against how most people are inclined to judge mind uploading scenarios. Um, one of the big things that bothers me about the way people sort of often disregard the identity of an upload in a non-destructive scenario is that I don't really think it's for external observers to be telling conscious people who they are or who they aren't. I don't think that identity is really for someone else to impose on you. So to come back to your example, it's just like, as I said, whether or not this person standing in front of you is, well, let me see, they either are or not Batman or Bruce Wayne, depending on whether other people recognize them one way or the other. I don't know. I mean, this is sort of, does your identity change because someone else doesn't recognize you? I'm not quite sure.
It certainly would affect your quality of experience of the world. Like if your mother no longer accepted you because you were an upload, for instance, like it would be kind
yes,
of traumatizing.
But if so to take a sad example, if your mother doesn't acknowledge your identity because she has Alzheimer's, does that mean that you yourself are not who you are, or does it just mean that her perception of who you are is wrong? Like, what difference does it make how other people perceive your identity? I don't get it. I don't get it.
Well, I guess you could sort of relate it to the idea of what is it? These distributed cognition sort of ideas or situated cognition. And I went to the university in Sydney and interviewed a few people. And one of them we were talking about sharing minds, like especially old people who have Alzheimer's, who've grown up. They've sort of been married for a long time, have shared experience over years and years and years, and then one of them starts losing their memory, but the other can sort of help them sort of remember. It's sort of like I don't know how it plays into identity.
Well, no, I mean, a really interesting idea is that I've read this, and I'm trying to see if I can explain it clearly, that when we get to know someone really well, essentially what we're doing socially and psychologically is building a rather imperfect model of their own mind in our mind. The reason you know what someone is like and you can make predictions about how they will behave in certain circumstances. The famous example is people who complete each other's sentences because they know each other. What you've essentially done, we haven't proven this at the neurological level, but one could suppose that you might have actually built little internal neural nets in your brain that are actually, sort of mirroring or sort of reinstantiating neural nets that were in the other person's brain. Maybe that's how it actually works in the brain. That in order to have a psychological model of someone's brain, you actually build a little neural net in your brain, some subset of neurons trained a certain way, so that they will behave and then give you predictions of that person's behavior. Now, here's the interesting implication. What does building a little bit of neural net of someone else's brain sound like? It sounds very much like mind uploading. It's a very, very incomplete model because you're not nearly making a neuron level or synapse level full complete model. For one thing, where would you leave your own brain in mind if you completely rewired it to hold someone else's? So this is a very sort of, it's just step one of a billion-step story. But it's a very interesting notion to think that we sort of hold these sort of very tiny little upload models of all the people we know. And there's actually, not to get too emotional about it, but there's this you could actually say that someone who is well known by someone else does not totally fully die. If that sort of little sort of impartial model of themselves survives in another person's brain and another person's sort of constant sort of running of the simulation. It's a fascinating notion. I don't really know what we should make of it. Maybe it's too loose a theory to do anything with, but I think it's rather elegant.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I've heard it before. It is a quite a nice sort of way of preserving I guess, the memory of people, and to say that they still live on in other people's minds. Yes.
Perhaps literally. They might
Perhaps
live
literally,
on.
but I wouldn't want to depend on it.
Well, again, now we're all into the preservation of identity. If you make a copy of a neural net, have you preserved the identity, or has the original identity died? We're full circle.
Hmm. So if somebody else's interpretation of my identity lived on, I still wouldn't be confident that would be enough for me to be happy with. If I
In
wanted, if
particular,
it
we're
was,
talking about very imperfect models in this particular case. So, yeah.
yes. Now, have you read Robin Hanson's Age of M?
I read an early version right before he released it.
Okay, so you perhaps commented on that and yeah, okay. Well, have you got any yeah, okay. Well, we should start wrapping up soon anyway. But have you got any brief reflections on his book there?
Well, so as with many people, I like Robin Hanson. I like his writing. I like watching interviews of him speaking. So here's my one objection. Not an objection, but a way in which he and I view things a little differently. He's an economist, to the best of my understanding, and he takes a very sort of prosaic sort of business sort of approach in his book. What are we going to do with? Let me see. His term is EMs. What are we going to do with emulated minds? How are we going to use them? Will we run them for a little while and shut them down? What does this mean in terms of what does this mean for the economy in terms of sort of labor and what it costs to get labor? I think this is what his book was about. I don't remember because it was several years ago I read it, but the one thing I do remember taking away from his book was that he treats EMs as tools. He just sort of describes them and writes about them as, okay, so this technological thing exists, which is an EM, and we can spin it up like spinning up a computer and send it off to do some work. And if I'm remembering sort of the way he conveyed it, he doesn't. He's not too sensitive to the notion of whether or not these things are conscious beings entitled to the respect and rights of any person. He seems to be more interested in kind of how they're useful as a tool. If I'm misrepresenting him, it's because I haven't read the book in a while. But that, I remember sort of taking that away, and it was something that irked me a little bit. I should read the book again. I hope I'm not misrepresenting him on that point.
Awesome. Well, yeah, that's been a great interview, and yeah, it's gone for just over an hour there. So thanks heaps for your time yet again, and I encourage everybody to look at the video which are on the Ship of Theseus, which Keith created. And yes, again, I'll have the link there in the description, and also the link to a paper you co-authored with Randall Kuhne, right? And that was what was it called again? The fallacy of favoring gradual replacement mind uploading over scan and copy.
Yeah. It's right there in the title. That's what the paper's about.
So yeah, thanks heaps for your time, and yeah, look forward to chatting again sometime in the future.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And thanks everybody for listening, and if you like what you heard, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Cheers, and bye for now.